So last week we talked about why Brazil looked so good heading into this World Cup, and I think we just got a glimpse of it. So the question is, are they even better than we thought? Because despite having a lot of tactical disadvantages against a good Serbia team, they won comfortably. And I wanted to make a quick little video on the magic that allowed that to happen, so let's do it. Brazil-Serbia was a game that really reinforced how strong Brazil are, but I've got to start with Serbia because Dragan Stojkovic has put together a really accomplished tactical team here, one that caused Brazil a lot of problems. It was a pretty unique system that was very fluid and was changing in every phase, from a 4-1-4-1 mid-block to an aggressive diamond press, a 4-3-3 on the ball, and then a deeper back five. A pretty crazy system that I'd like to cover in more depth, so hopefully Serbia progress and I get the chance to. But because we're focusing on Brazil, I'm going to mainly talk about the Serbian defensive shape, starting with that five at the back. And I'm using the formations loosely because, like I said, it was a very fluid system, and it was more about obeying certain principles than staying in a rigid shape. I'm going to be pretty brief going over these, but those principles boiled down to 1. Having width in the back line, 2. Compactness around the ball, and 3. Being very aggressive. The combination of these three things had two really big benefits against Brazil's 4-3-3. For one, the width of the back line allowed them to double up on the Brazilian wingers, who tend to stay high and wide, but it also gave them numerical advantages in the middle, where the likes of Neymar were frequently surrounded by Serbian shirts, making it very congested and hard to play their typical combination game. And that final principle, the aggression, really manifested as a man-to-man press. And that's the reason for these unorthodox looking shapes, as the Serbian players were more interested in the players they had to mark than the space around them. So any pass into midfield was met with immediate pressure. Even if that meant a defender had to step up very high, they were brave enough to do it. They'd also then change the shape into a diamond to press Brazil man-to-man when they had the ball at the back. And my favourite part of this system was the role of the fullbacks, who were playing this very brave dual role, sort of between midfield and defence, frequently abandoning the winger they were supposed to mark in favour of putting pressure on Brazil's fullbacks, who are arguably their least comfortable in progression. And all of this made life hard for Brazil. Rather than allowing them to waltz into the final third, Serbia put every player ahead of the ball under pressure and forced Brazil to be brilliant. And for large parts of this game, they weren't brilliant. Actually, despite this great Serbia setup, Brazil really didn't help themselves with their own tactics. Firstly, there wasn't nearly enough movement and rotation in the front line to disrupt this press. So when Neymar dropped deep, for example, there was a gaping hole in front of him that nobody was interested in occupying, making his options really limited. And Neymar didn't have the best game. He made some poor decisions, lost the ball probably too often, but his dropping deep and wanting to make things happen could have been useful if he'd had more rotation around him. But Alexandro was really hesitant to push up, and Vinicius almost never drifted in off the touchline. But the bigger problem was actually their attacking mentality, because against such a narrow midfield, despite the numerical disadvantages we talked about, they were just trying too often to force their way through, trying to dribble past 2 or 3 players, or forcing a pass through bodies. They certainly could have been a little more patient, moved the ball from side to side, and exploited the space on either side of that narrow block. And this is the interesting thing about Brazil as a nation compared to someone like Spain, for example. While Spain would have known from the beginning to circulate the ball patiently, move from left to right, create these premeditated triangles, Brazil put more stock into the natural instincts of their players, so when they can't find solutions or don't really know what to do, it shows. But to be fair, this was seemingly addressed somewhat in the second half, as Brazil started to take advantage of the narrow midfield by having Neymar drift inside and then use Alexandro as an outlet in space. Whether this is the influence from the coach or the players just starting to understand what they're up against, it's hard to tell, but ironically it actually wasn't any tactical tweak or change that won Brazil the game. In fact, a lot of their problems persisted into the second half. The interesting part, and the reason I made this video, was that they won this game despite so many disadvantages, which comes down purely to Brazil's major asset, quality. Because the first goal, which really opened up the game and forced Serbia to take more risks, came from Neymar once again being surrounded by 4 players. But the weight on the pass was perfect, the drop of the shoulder and the touch took every one of those players out of the game, and Brazil took advantage. And this is the scary proposition for every other team in this tournament, because it really shows you can put together a dedicated system to stop this team. You can force them into errors and even take away control, but there is almost no answer to pure quality. But to wrap this up, I just want to discuss one additional thing that we learned about this team, and also how they'll deal with one very important injury. We know Brazil have a lot of brilliance and quality, but what they're really committed to, probably more than anything else, is solidity. We've seen a couple of upsets already in this tournament, and they're usually down to defensive lapses, and I'd be surprised, though I don't want to jinx it, if we see the same from Brazil. I talked a lot in my preview video about how exactly Brazil press and defend, so I won't go into details, but the one thing that stood out here was how few players they actually commit forward. I mentioned Alexandro, for example, and it was very clear that neither fullback had any intention of moving ahead of the ball. In fact, a lot of Brazil's attacking problems came because they were outnumbered. They were very hesitant to commit a lot of bodies forward. You'd see scenarios like this a lot, with only a handful of players forward and effectively a defensive barrier behind them to prevent counterattacks and win it back quickly. Here's another of many examples, which is actually the build-up to the first goal. And because Brazil take their defending so seriously, even at the cost of creating threat, this is going to be a very difficult team to beat. But that's not to say they're perfect, because while they lack sufficient quality, I actually think Serbia gave us a couple of glimpses of where the weaknesses are in the Brazil team. For one, their front two can be a bit on and off in terms of intensity and cutting down passing lanes, so I think teams who move the ball well will be able to find free options in midfield quite often. And the second weakness is potentially width, because Brazil stay very, very compact, and moving the ball from side to side with quality on those flanks is something that this team could struggle with, so we'll see. But before we finish, I should briefly talk about the injury to Neymar. It looks like he'll be out at least until the end of the group stage, and it is a huge blow, don't get me wrong. But so long as he isn't underplaying how bad it is, in the short term, it isn't catastrophic. Brazil have more than enough quality forwards to get them out of this group stage, and a player I'd really like to see in that role is Rodrigo. I think Rodrigo is really special. Every time I watch him, he's just so electric. The way he moves and the quickness of his touches, plus the quality ball striking and a scoring instinct. As a number 10 for this team, I think he'd be a really good fit. So anyway, that'll do for now. I'm not going to be able to cover these games with the usual forensic depth, but let me know if you enjoyed this. I think next up will be Germany versus Spain, so look out for that. And until next time, take care.